Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, today we have a very, very special guest. It's none other than Jesse Schell, and I'm sure you've heard the name before. But before we introduce Jesse formally, Jesse, are you prepared to engage?
I am totally prepared to engage.
Let's do this, because Jesse Schell, as you know, is the CEO of Schell Games, which is a team of 100 people who strive to make truly great games, both for the purposes of entertainment and education, including award-winning VR games such as I Expect You to Die, HoloLAB Champions, and Star Wars, Droid Repair Bay. Jesse serves as a distinguished professor of the practice of entertainment technology at Carnegie Mellon University and is the author of the award-winning book, The Art of Game Design, a Book of Lenses, which, if you haven't read, I definitely recommend you to get a copy, borrow a copy from somebody you know, and read it. It is, many people have called it the Bible of game design and of many other things, so I definitely recommend getting that book. Jesse, is there anything I missed from your intro?
Nope, I don't think so. I think we're good to go.
Fantastic. So, Jesse, we usually kickstart the whole interview with getting to know our guests even a bit better beyond the intro. And usually what we like to know is, what does being Jesse Schell in a world like this one, in a day like today or any other day you like to pick, what does it look like? What does it feel like to be Jesse Schell?
Oh, well, let's see. I guess being me feels pretty busy because I'm doing a number of jobs. I CEO here at Schell Games, and we're typically making probably about 8 games at a time, and so that's a lot to deal with. And then on top of that, I teach at Carnegie Mellon University, and so there's a lot going on there as well.
Very, very interesting. Quite a few things to get excited about, which I'm sure you are, even though, being busy is like, I don't know, I'm sure you're very, very busy, but what I mean by this is that, like, today's world is being busy is like the new thing. Everybody is or wants to look like being busy. It's an interesting thing I've seen lately.
It's certainly a lot more possible than it used to be.
Yeah,
no doubt about it.
So, Jesse, we also like to use one of the first questions to talk about, because we know that you're doing incredible work. There's many things to talk about in the success space, which we will get into. But we also like to get started with the rhythm as well, talking about what we like to call a fail or a first attempt in learning story. About a time you probably set out to do an educational game and an entertainment game. You set out to do something and it definitely didn't work as you were expecting. And again, you would probably like to call it a fail. And of course, what did you learn from that experience? How did you, manage to turn it around or, to take a look at the next project? What did it look like? What did you learn? And we want to be there with you in that story.
Boy, oh boy, I've got a lot of those stories.
Your favorite one?
No doubt about it. Probably I'm having a hard time picking. There's just so many to choose from.
I think it's part of daily life now.
Yeah, probably the one that that might be most instructive is the first piece of internal IP that Schell Games tried to develop. It was a game called Ordinary, which the dream of it was to create a game that could tell a kind of story that games normally couldn't tell. So the goal of it was for it to be a game that was about an office romance, about a really ordinary guy working at this office, trying to find a way to connect with a woman at the office, even though everything else is going wrong in his life and at the office. And we had a really unusual mechanic for this game, which was that you didn't control the main character directly. You instead were living inside this character's mind. And as his mind got flooded with different emotions, those emotions were puzzle blocks. that you would use in a kind of a match three sort of puzzle. So it was this unusual idea where you were doing a unique kind of match three that would navigate an interactive story. And there were a lot of things we loved about this. It was kind of fun. It was kind of unusual. It had a beautiful art style. The characters were hand-drawn, but the backgrounds were all black and white photographs. And the crazy part about this is we were doing this all before the indie game revolution. We started doing this in probably 2004, 2005, something like that.
Wow.
So there was no App Store. There was no Steam. So our only path for it that we saw was the DS. So we were taking this around to publishers, trying to get them to go for this nutty game. And we weren't getting a lot of traction on that. But it was good because it let us talk to various publishers and built relationships, and that was something. Then they announced, hey, guess what? We're going to put downloadables on the DS. There's going to be a DS store. And we were like, oh, this is great. We can just go for it and do it ourselves. We don't need to get a publisher. We'll just make a downloadable game. And so, oh man, I'm actually losing. I'm trying, like my thread on this gets so weird. Oh, so we were thinking about that, but then at the same time we were realizing, wow, this game isn't really gelling the way we wanted. All our prototypes, as much as we liked it and we loved our match three mechanic, the connection between the match three and the emotional stuff, it just wasn't working as well as it should have. And we tried like 20 things in order to make it work. And we fussed around with this for years. And then eventually we said, you know what, to heck with this. And we threw out the Office Romance thing and we turned it into something more like Puzzle Quest, so that it was like a battle. You used the match three, but for a battle system. And it was a game called Jelly Kingdoms. And we had a really cool art style and we were going to do all of that. And it actually got a big write-up in Nintendo Power Magazine because we were going to do it as a downloadable for DS. And then Nintendo announces, hey, guess what? We're now going to have this new thing, the 3DS. And we're like, wait a minute. Our game's not 3D. What's going to happen to the downloadables in the store? Are you going to put them like in a 2D ghetto or something? What are we going to do? And Nintendo's like, oh, we don't know. We're not sure what we're going to do with that. And I'm like, wait a minute. So you mean we're going to do all this work, put this game up, make it downloadable, and then you may actually shut down that store, or you may forbid 2D games, and they're like, yeah, we don't know what we're going to do. And at that point we said, oh my gosh, to heck with this. Let's take it over to the iPad, because by that time the iPad had shown up. And so we started doing a lot of work on that. But then being a small studio and having other commitments, like we couldn't quite get it to make the progress as fast as we wanted. We ended up having to put it on a shelf for a little bit. And by the time we took it off the shelf, the whole app market had changed. And whereas we'd been looking at, we'll put it on the iPad, we'll go up against Plants vs. Zombies, we'll sell it for $6, that'll be fine. By the time we took it off the shelf, that had all gone away. And now everything had to be free and free to play. And we were like, we're not ready to convert this thing. And so the whole thing ended up just in cinders, even though it was basically two different games, which were both beautiful in their own way. They both had this really great match three thing. And then the part that really killed me is the match three mechanic that we loved so much. Someone else discovered it. It was a Japanese company who made the game Puzzle and Dragons, if you've ever seen that. And they made literally $1 billion off of this match three mechanic, taking it free to play. So this had fails on it like at every conceivable level. So we learned a lot of things out of that adventure.
What would you say, like, I know that there's like at least 3 or 4 points in time where you said like this happened and then this happened, and then there were like many mini or macro failures at different levels. But when you take a step back and you look at what happened with your loved game or games, actually, what would you say is something that maybe from the start you would have done different? Or I don't know, what hindsight is I know is 2020, but what would you do differently if you had to approach a challenge like that one today?
One of the things I've definitely learned and have been actively doing is when you come up with a big vision for a game and how you want it to be, that's great, but often what you want to do is figure out, well, what is the smallest piece of this we could make into a successful game? If I have to look back at the story of Ordinary and Jelly Kingdoms, I wish we had just taken that match 3 game and made it and put it out there as like a solid match 3. It was a novel, new kind of gameplay. It had a really good feeling about it, but we were so caught up in having that be the inner loop for a thing with a big story and an outer loop that it just slowed us down, and it ended up making more game than we were able to produce. As a flip to that, an example of us learning the lesson, next on August 27th, we're coming out with Until You Fall on Steam, which is our VR sword fighting game. Initially, it started as a much bigger vision. It started as it was going to be multiplayer and co-op, and have, big, massive mission packs and all kinds of things. And as we worked on it, we realized, nope, we don't need all those things. We don't need explorable terrain. We don't need multiplayer. What we need is a really great sword fighting game, as simple as we can make it. And so we've done that. And so we're going to put it out in early access, and then we're going to plan to grow it over time. We did the same thing with our VR game called I Expect You to Die. We initially put it out as a single level, even though we conceived it as like a 40-hour AAA game. We realized, that's not necessary. We don't really have the resources to do that. So we found ways to kind of scale it down to something small and great. So that's, I think, the biggest lesson. Take the best part of your idea and make it as small and great as possible.
It's kind of a small, I don't want to call it prototype or MVP, but it's, again, just like you said it's take the smallest atom that you can take out of it that could have a game in it and do it. And that simplifies, that takes off a lot of steam and pressure from your game. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, because if that can't work, then your basis probably isn't that good anyway. And if that can work and does work, well, guess what? You're going to have something people like, and they're going to demand sequels, and you can do all that fancy stuff in the future. And so it means you have to be more patient for that, but you're going to get there as opposed to, we still look back with great sadness at both Ordinary and Jelly Kingdoms at like all the work we put into those. And so much of it was so good, but we just couldn't find a way to get those things finished in a way that was going to work. And much better to kind of not do the work and be sad that you didn't have a chance to do it than to do the work and be sad that no one had a chance to see it.
Absolutely, definitely. So, Jesse, flipping that on its head, what would you say is a challenge that you faced or something that you wanted to create? Maybe focusing this time on some educational game or some game with a purpose that you might have made as well. It was a challenge that you faced, and of course you had a lot of success with it. And tell us like that story. What would you attribute that success? So we want to learn a lot from that story as well.
Oh, sure. I think in terms of picking a story about an educational game that was very successful for us, I would point to a game we created called Happy Atoms. Happy Atoms is a pretty unusual sort of thing. It's a science kit that it's kind of designed for kids 10 and up, and what it lets you do is molecular modeling. So, the sort of ball and stick modeling is of atoms and molecules is something people are very familiar with. But I'd always thought about the fact that as much as balls and sticks are kind of like Tinker Toys or a building set, you never see kids playing with them. And I kind of wondered why that was. And so I was examining ball and stick modeling kits. It's clear that the modeling kits themselves, the balls and sticks, they let you build whatever you want, even if nature doesn't allow it. And I thought that was kind of crazy. Like, why do it like that? Why not make the balls and sticks so they actually have the same structure that actual atoms do, so that anybody can figure out what molecules it's possible to build? And so I started building little sets like that. Initially, I made them with ribbons and snaps and these wooden discs in order to to test it out. And I started testing it with kids. And so far, this is all physical. And it's funny, the way I got to the physical part was first I tried to do this as a video game, and I found it was really unsatisfying to do it as a pure video game of like connecting atoms to atoms, because you had to connect all these different electrons to all these different electrons, and it felt really tedious. I got to connect this one and 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 this one. And I kept thinking, man, if I could just grab these with my hands as opposed to trying to slide it with a mouse or slide it with a single finger, if I could just grab with my hands and just kind of snap them together, that's what I want to do. So that's why I started making physical models and realizing that could kind of work. So I built a bunch of physical models, started testing them with kids in science classes and things, and found that the kids were really engaged with it and they really understood how this worked. The problem with it, of course, is like, okay, that's just a physical toy. Well, what else can you do with it? And the big problem is, a kid might build, like they might be like, hey, I've got like 3 carbons and 4 hydrogens and an oxygen and a beryllium, and like, what is this? And the set is telling them this is a real molecule, but they have no idea what it is. And how could they possibly even find out? It's not even clear. So we started to wonder, could we use digital technology in order to reveal that? And we did. We started doing experiments with a vision system, so that you point a camera at the model set that you've built, and then we look it up in a database of molecules, and it tells you which one that you built. And we got this working pretty well. And so ultimately, we built this system so that you buy this science kit, which has all these different atoms that, instead of being snaps, they all work with magnets and like little rubber arms, and they're pretty cool. They're really fun to touch, and they snap together really well. And then you take out your free app on your iPhone or your iPad or your Android or whatever, and we basically send you on this quest to build all these different molecules. So this has been very successful for us. We ended up getting multiple grants from the U.S. government in order to build this for the Department of Education, and that really helped get the funding off the ground for it. We partnered with a toy company, Thames and Cosmos. They're the world's largest producer of science kits, and they ended up producing the physical end of it. And it's done very well. And one thing that was exciting for us recently is a child set a Guinness World Record for fastest recitation of the periodic table of the elements. And so he's this 12-year-old kid, and he breaks the world record for that. And they're interviewing him, and they say, well, how did you get so good at this? And he says, well, I love learning about chemistry, and the thing that really got me into it was this thing called happy atoms. And so that was really fun to see.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's been a good success for us.
That's exciting. There's again, just listening to you and trying to draw some of the inspiration I get from that directly. There's so many things that could be talked about, but what I wanted to mention was, and it's something that we've been recurringly getting back and forth. It's the whole, games don't need to be digital. They don't need to be physical. They can be either. And this is a beautiful combination of the two of them. I mean, I think that's one of the key things that I get from what your experience that you had on this, and how satisfying it was to be able to mix your experience also with digital games and the virtual. It's kind of a augmented reality kind of the camera, I guess.
Yeah. For me, like the thing that always gets me most excited are things that combine technologies in new ways to create something that just wasn't even possible before. And so things that cross the physical digital boundary, I get very excited about, because very few people are willing to go there. And there's so many interesting things in that space. It's not well explored. So at our studio, we do it a lot. We do interactive theme park rides, interactive museum exhibits, interactive toys. We do a thing here at our studio called Jam Week. We just finished it last week, where everything at the studio stops and everybody just works on passion projects for a week. And the one that I worked on was an idea for an autonomous toy car that uses kind of computer vision in order to navigate its environment, but you can still play with it in interesting ways. So I love this space between the physical and the digital a great deal.
Yeah, it sounds very, very exciting, and I think it's one of the things to reflect upon. Like when you're thinking and considering what's the solution that you're looking for, you want to solve X problem. It's easy to go with what you've already seen, what's already been done. And it's not always the best solution. Maybe it is. Many times it is. But thinking outside of that preconceived solutions and the things that have already been done, I think is a very exciting place to explore for sure and get inspiration from.
Yeah, I think it's the most fun space, and very often it's the least explored space. So sometimes there's some really nice low-hanging fruit in those spaces if you're brave enough to kind of go in there and learn all the hard lessons, because very few people are willing to combine two different fields like that. And as a result, those areas are not well explored.
Absolutely. So Jesse, I was listening to you and trying to think of what is your thought process when you're creating one of these. Again, it could be educational games. I'd rather focus on that one, but maybe your process is a bit more general. I don't know. You have a studio. You definitely have things that you have already figured out in that sense. So the question is if there's any sort of process, series of steps, or how do you approach a project? You're starting a project. Where does it start? What are the steps that you take, and how do you guide your studio through until you actually have a final or semi-final product?
Yeah, well, we have lots of different processes for the many different phases that projects have. The first process is always a simple question. The question is, what problem are we really solving? And often I find that teams struggle because they're not on the same page about the answer to that question. Someone might say, "Oh, we want to make a VR game." Okay, why? Is it because you want to learn about VR and this will let you do it? Maybe you want to do it because you see VR is a growing market and you think that you could be very successful from a market point of view? Or could it be that you already have an idea for something that would only work in a VR, and is that the reason? So getting that clearly stated about what problem are we solving, it is really important. So as an example, I mentioned the Until You Fall, our new sword fighting VR game. We created that partly in response to our previous VR game, which was I Expect You to Die, which has been very successful. But it's a puzzle game, and the challenge that we have with it, because it's a collection of these missions where you're escaping from these different death traps. And while it's very popular and we're very proud of it, it's very hard to create new content for, because each puzzle takes months to design, months to implement, months to test, and it doesn't allow us to have a very strong connection with our community. And so there's kind of a limit to how fast we can create the content for it and how much of a community can form, because around a puzzle game there's not a lot of room for community, because if you get together to talk, all you're doing is giving each other spoilers. and that's a bummer. So we looked at a question of like, well, if we're going to do another game, how can we create one that would get people talking all the time? And how could we create one where we could be dropping new content constantly and be able to afford to do that? And so the way the design of our Until You Fall sword game was very much so that it would be repeatable, not one-off content that was very hand-built, but instead procedurally generated content to the extent that it could be, that was very replayable. And further, we tried to design combat systems that would facilitate the addition of new weapons, the addition of new powers, so that we could be dropping these in quite a lot, further dropping in new monsters, further dropping in new dungeons, on and on and on, to be able to drop in new things all the time and have something that, since it's replayable, people would have a lot to talk about, have a lot of strategies to compare. And so that was a big iteration, and we got there because we said, okay, we're not just building a cool game, we want to build a game that has a strong community. We want to build a game that we can update easily and frequently. And going in from that basis, using those as our constraints, we were able to all be on the same page about what we were designing and why.
That's great. That's great. That makes a lot of sense. Understanding what are your, if you understand what your objectives are, you'll understand as well what are your restrictions, and hence many things can be happening. And having everybody aligned, especially when you have a team like you do, the alignment for the team and people, everybody understanding where you're all going for is definitely something that is key and central to actually get to move forward.
Definitely.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So, Jesse, we would like to know if you have any sort of, maybe call it best practice or, element, strategy, however you wanna face it, that is something that you think the creation of any game or educational game would benefit from. Like, if you do this, you'll probably get a better result or a faster result or whatever you want to gear it towards. Is there such a thing for you?
Oh, well, we have lots and lots of things like that. One that comes to mind for me that made a real difference at our studio is what we call the 50% rule. And the 50% rule is that when you're working on a project that you know is going to have some kind of fixed period of time, your goal should be that at 50% of the way through your calendar schedule, you should have all of the key features working and playable. And this is a bit counterintuitive because most people look at it and say, well, I've got all these key features. I'm going to spread them over the schedule. We'll plan to kind of have all key features in by maybe 80% of the way through the schedule, and then we'll still have that last 20% to really make the game great. The problem with that is that schedules slip, and that 80% often turns into 90% or 99%. And you'll end up with a game where like we didn't even get all the key features in, and we had to kind of push it out the door, and we didn't really have a chance to make it great. Whereas if you plan to have them all in at the 50% mark and things slip a little bit, you still got room. And then further, now you've got a large amount of time to really make the game great. And we developed this rule by, at some point in our studio's history, we were looking back at like, hey, we had some projects that are really successful and some projects that were real struggles and real flops. Let's put them both in two columns and kind of figure out what are the commonalities. And the thing that jumped out at us was all the ones that we were successful, we had all those key features at the halfway mark, and the ones that weren't, the key features came in late, and there was no chance to make them great. And seeing that, knowing that, we've really made that a key part of our process, both with our own games, and we do, of course, a lot of work for hire games. And that can be a hard sell when you're going to a client and saying, look, I know you want to have all these features, but we're going to set up the calendar so that no new features come in after this point, because we want to make sure that we're going to build you something that's truly, truly great. So we've gotten pretty good at selling it. But for me, that's, in terms of one single thing that we did that pointed us toward quality, I would say it would be that.
Great. That's actually an awesome recommendation, especially for the implementation, which is absolutely fundamental for any project. And Jesse, if you had to recommend to the engagers one book, besides, of course, The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses, which is your book, what book would that be and why?
Oh my gosh, there's so many good and helpful books in the world. I mean, I think it really depends on your context.
For building, for example, games for education, what would be a book that you would recommend?
I struggle, honestly, with that question in terms of a strong book for building games for education. I don't know if right now I can point to one that, well, let me take that back. Yeah, no, so building games for education, yes. I would definitely point to Sabrina Sulba's book, The Transformational Game Framework. This is a free download from the ETC Press. You can also order a print copy of it. It is a beautiful and gorgeous book. It has lots of very thoughtfully done illustrations and diagrams of the challenging process of creating transformational games and the difficult business of working with subject matter experts and building bridges between the game developers and the subject matter experts. So yeah, that would be the one I would.
Fantastic. That's a great recommendation, and the fact that it's free always gets more people to be able to access the book for sure.
Yep. Yes, it's Sabrina Sulba, and Sulba is spelled Cullyba.
Fantastic. We'll put it in the show notes for sure. So engagers, if you go to professorgame.com, you just type Jesse, and you will definitely find this episode, and you will have access directly to that link, which I'll put up after the episode goes live. And Jesse, if in that same sense of recommendations, and after having spent together almost 30 minutes by now, and understanding a bit of how this interview goes, is there anybody that comes to your mind that you would think that you would like to listen to in an episode like this one, in this podcast, in Professor Game?
Oh, what an interesting question. Boy, oh boy. Oh, man, there's so many people.
Just to provide you a few more seconds to think about that. When I was starting the podcast, I told my family, my friends, and so on. And one of the persons who approached me and like with a worried face was my mom, and she said, like, "But are you sure you want to do this like every week? Where are you going to find people who are experts and who are doing interesting things around this?" And I said, like, you have literally, and it's normal, you have no idea. Like, there's so many super interesting people, and by now we're rounding episode 100 or already past episode 100 by this time as well. So, you know, it's definitely that's not been a struggle for sure. It's picking.
One person I certainly think of is Barbara Chamberlain, who runs the Learning Games Lab in New Mexico. And she is such an expert on playtesting. She and I have actually been working on a book about educational games together.
Nice.
And she has so many remarkable insights about the best ways to playtest. And I mean, especially with children and especially with educational games, but really just in general. So she would be a wonderful guest. Another really interesting person is Warren Buckleitner, who runs the Duster Magic conference. He has studied the world of children's software and educational software for decades, and he has a lot of thoughts and insights about what works and what doesn't, and what's healthy and what's not.
Fantastic. Those are absolutely great recommendations. And changing the subject a little bit, we're coming from recommendation. Well, it's kind of a recommendation maybe as well. What would you say is your favorite game?
It's funny. That's always a tough question, right? Because it changes.
It's probably the most difficult one.
Yeah, it changes a lot over time. But in terms of, I have a funny answer. I guess I sort of have two answers. One is a game that really captivated me and really made me appreciate kind of the magic of games. Was a game called Blast Corps for the Nintendo 64. Almost no one played this game, but it's just this crazy, beautiful idea. The concept is that there's a truck on a highway that has a nuclear warhead on it that's being transported. Somehow, the warhead has accidentally been armed, and the driver has fled the truck. And so a truck is hurtling down the highway with a nuclear warhead on it, and it's heading towards a town. Your job is to get everything out of the way of this truck. And the town's been evacuated, and you're just this one person running around the town trying to figure out how you're going to do this. So it's this crazy action puzzle solving game because it's a 3D game. And you do stuff like, okay, I've got to get in the taxi so I can get over here to the bulldozer. I'm going to drive the bulldozer onto the back of the train. I'm going to now get out of the bulldozer. I'm going to get in the train cab. I'm going to drive the train into town so that I can unload the bulldozer. And now I can start using the bulldozer to knock down buildings. And I'm going to knock down these buildings, and the truck is coming. But guess what? In the basement of the third building, it turns out, unexpectedly, there's a giant robot. And then you find the giant robot. Now you get in that. And now you can use that to smash other buildings. And so you're doing all this trying to work around the truck, because if you touch it, it all goes up in a giant nuclear holocaust. And it's just this weird, crazy, beautiful game that I just absolutely fell in love with. I always like games that go in really super weird places. So that's usually my go-to in terms of my personal favorite game.
Fantastic. And Jesse, we've spoken about many things and many of the very great abilities you have and you and your team. But what would you say when creating games is your superpower? I don't know, in any of the facets, and whatever it is that you do best, your sweet spot.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. When it comes to just straight up game design, I think because I've always loved games so much and I've looked at so many games over the years and I think about games all the time, I find that my subconscious mind is really good at thinking about game structures and problems. It's to the point where I feel like I don't do the work anymore. I just watch my subconscious mind doing it. So someone will be like showing me a game and they're saying, oh, I'm having this problem. And I don't have to sit and think. What I do is I look at the problem and then I watch what my mind is doing, and I see it presenting all of these different ways to kind of solve the problem. And I see all these different game ideas kind of flicking through and evolving like in my mind, and many of them are being discarded because they're bad, but then some of them are starting to work, and so they grow. And it happens super fast, and then I can just kind of sketch those out. And so that's the closest thing I think I have to some kind of gaming superpower.
I would definitely take that as a superpower.
It definitely speeds things along for me. I can find myself getting to solutions. And it took me, the funny thing was, to develop that superpower, the main thing I had to do was get out of its way. Because it's really tempting when those things start to show up in your brain to kind of analyze them too much and say, well, wait a minute, that one's not a good idea because of this, and this one shouldn't because of that. And that just, I found that doing that just slows the whole process down. So learning to kind of not judge everything that pops up helps a great deal. And strangely, I'm a person who does daily meditation. I believe that the meditation helps foster this, because meditation helps you separate your sort of conscious will from the rest of your mind, and lets things run a little smoother and better.
Absolutely. I've been also not for too long every day either. I've been trying to meditate every day for probably almost 2 years by now. It's a game changer for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Jesse, we're almost running out of time, but before you go, I would like to know if you have any final piece of advice, especially for people who are dipping their toes or thinking of getting into, maybe game design, maybe creating their own games. They had their teachers and they're creating a small mini game for their classroom. People who are taking a look at this and asking themselves if there is value or not, if it's worth it making the effort. If you have any, final piece of advice for them, of course, let us know where we can find more info about you, maybe on social media. I don't know, whatever you want to show, and then we'll say it's game over for now.
Okay. Well, I know my main piece of advice, particularly for people who are new to game design and development, it can be very easy to judge whether game design is the right thing for you by looking at how good am I at it? And that's the wrong way to judge it, because in the beginning, and also for the rest of your life, you're going to be bad at it. You're going to make terrible judgments. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have game ideas you were really excited about, and it turns out they were quite terrible. If you judge your abilities based on, do I make good or bad games, that's a mistake. The thing to judge is whether, are you enjoying what you're doing? Because if you enjoy what you're doing, just keep doing it, and you will get better. And your games, you'll learn lessons, and you'll go on, and you'll be strong. So,
yeah, enjoying the journey is definitely very important for this.
Yeah, Linda Berry has a couple different art books about these topics. One of them is called Picture This, and they really are very inspiring because they're really about the main thing that you need to do as a creator is stop judging your work. Just make things. Just do it and get in there and do it and just let it happen. And you can later kind of think about, well, do I like this one? Do I not like this one? But don't let that dominate your thinking. It just slows you down and makes you think that you can't do things that you really can.
Wow, that's actually very profound and very, very deep for the engagers, for the listeners. So thank you very much for that advice.
Sure.
Finally, Jesse,
in terms of,
yep.
I was just the social media stuff you're asking about. The easiest thing, if you go to jesseschell.com, that's sort of my central hub to find out about everything that I'm doing and that I'm up to.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Very much.
Oh, yep. Sure thing. I should just throw in there, I think next week, I think it's August 28th, the third edition of Art of Game Design will be released into the world. So you can look for that.
Great. By the time the episode goes live, that date is certainly going to be passed. So we will include it in the show notes. And
Great.
People can go to find it wherever your book is being sold.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Thanks again very much for your time. I don't know, in these minutes that we spent together, I'm sure many games would have been started, and a lot of management of your team would have happened. So me and the name of the engagers, I'd like to thank you very much for spending this time with us. However, for now and for today at least, it's time to say it's game over.
All right, thanks.
Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Jesse Schell. And are you using Instagram? You know, I'm using it more and more, and I would love to connect with you there. And just like on Twitter, my username is RobAlvarezB. And before you go onto your next mission, would you like to know how to create VR and AR worlds and use gamification for all of these things without needing to code? Then you will have to subscribe using your favorite podcast app and then listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.